Global energy markets were thrown into turmoil on Monday after the Strait of Hormuz was effectively shut down, disrupting the movement of roughly 20 million barrels of oil and fuel per day through one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. The closure, centered in the narrow waterway between Iran and Oman, immediately triggered panic across crude markets, refinery supply chains, and futures trading desks. The Strait of Hormuz normally handles about 1/5 of global petroleum consumption, making it a choke point that can rattle prices within hours. With tanker traffic sharply reduced and insurers reportedly reassessing risk, traders move fast to price in shortages, higher freight costs, and potential delays in deliveries to Asia, Europe, and the United States. In plain English, when this lane gets jammed, the whole energy system starts acting like it just got gaslit. Oil prices surged in early trading as refiners and fuel distributors scrambled to secure replacement cargoes, while gasoline and diesel markets followed with their own spike in volatility. Market participants said the shock was not limited to crude alone, since liquefied petroleum gas, condensate, and refined products also rely on the same corridor. That means the problem is not just a headline about oil. It is a full chain disruption hitting transport, manufacturing, and consumer fuel costs at the same time. The timing could hardly be worse for governments already dealing with inflation, pressure, and fragile growth forecasts. Central banks, shipping firms, and energy importers are now being forced to model a scenario in which supply is rerouted, delayed, or priced far higher than before. POV, this is the kind of event that turns temporary volatility into a policy headache with a very expensive receipt. Analysts said the immediate question is not whether markets notice the closure, but how long the disruption lasts and whether producers outside the region can fill the gap. Strategic reserves may help soften the first blow, but they cannot replace a corridor that moves millions of barrels a day. And that is why the first shock is only the beginning. Iran's retaliation on Tuesday widened the crisis beyond the Strait of Hormuz, with regional officials and shipping operators warning that the conflict is now pushing directly into the global energy trade. Several tanker owners and charterers began pulling vessels from exposed routes, a move that immediately tightened freight markets and raised the odds of delayed deliveries to Asia and Europe. The first wave of withdrawals came as insurers reassessed coverage for ships transiting the Gulf, according to industry sources cited by Reuters and Lloyd's List. That matters because once insurers start acting like nervous Karens with a clipboard, the whole chain slows down. Fewer ships, higher premiums, and more cargo sitting still instead of moving. Traders said the market was no longer pricing only a supply shock, but also a logistics shock that could last for weeks if attacks or counterattacks continue. Brent crude jumped above $120 a barrel in intraday trading, its highest level in months, as buyers scrambled for replacement barrels and refiners locked in supply wherever they could find it. According to market analysts, the move reflected both the loss of Middle East exports and a wider fear that spare capacity outside the region may not be enough to calm the market quickly. In other words, this is where the energy game stops being a headline and starts becoming a bill. The price spike is already feeding through to diesel, jet fuel, and shipping costs, with freight brokers reporting higher day rates for tankers and more hesitation from cargo owners. That creates a second-order problem for importers. Even if crude can be sourced elsewhere, the cost of moving it has jumped, and the market hates paying extra for the privilege of being gaslit by geography. For governments, the danger is obvious. Inflation gets a fresh kick, central banks get less room to breathe, and consumers end up paying for a conflict they did not start. Oil executives and trading desks are now watching for any sign that producers outside the Gulf can raise output fast enough to offset the disruption. The United States has strategic reserves, but analysts say those barrels can cushion only part of the hit, not replace a corridor that handles millions of barrels a day. POV, this is the moment when every emergency plan gets tested in real time, and most of them look a lot less impressive under pressure than Canada sees its opening. Mark Carney moved quickly on Wednesday, presenting Canada to buyers in Asia and Europe as a stable alternative energy supplier, as markets reeled from the widening Middle East conflict and President Donald Trump's blockade rhetoric added fresh pressure to global trade routes. Ottawa's message was blunt. Canada can help fill the gap, but only if customers are willing to sign long-term deals and accept the country's higher transport costs. The pitch was aimed at refiners, utilities, and traders now hunting for barrels outside the Gulf. Carney's team has been telling counterparts that Canada offers rule of law stability, reliable production, and a political environment far less likely to collapse into another supply shock overnight. In a market this spooked that sells, stability has suddenly become a product, and Canada is trying to market it before somebody else does. Officials and industry executives say the strategy is to turn the crisis into a commercial opening, especially with European buyers trying to reduce exposure to volatile routes and Asian buyers looking for backup supply. Canada already exports significant volumes of crude and LNG to the United States, but Ottawa wants to widen the map and position itself as a more dependable partner for allies nervous about Middle East disruption. The idea is simple. If the Gulf is the problem, Canada wants to be the workaround. Trump's blockade language, meanwhile, is doing the opposite of what energy markets need. By signaling more confrontation and less predictability, Washington is making insurers, shippers, and buyers even more cautious about routing cargo through exposed corridors. That leaves Carney with a rare opening to argue that Canada is not just a commodity producer, but a geopolitical safe haven for energy supply. POV in a crisis, boring is suddenly sexy. The problem is that selling barrels is not the same thing as moving them. Canada's oil patch can produce, but the country still depends on pipelines, rail, port access, and export terminals that were not built for a world where every extra barrel has to be rerouted at speed. Industry analysts say that makes Canada's pitch credible in theory and constrained in practice, especially if Asian and European buyers want large volumes quickly. That tension is already showing up in the logistics math. Western Canadian producers can increase shipments only so far before they hit bottlenecks in pipeline capacity and port throughput, and new projects remain years away from completion. Rail can help in a pinch, but it is more expensive and less efficient, which means the premium Canada can charge for stability may get eaten up by the cost of getting the product to Tidewater. Translation: the market may want Canada, but the system has to be able to deliver Canada. Carney's challenge is also political. Any serious effort to become a bigger energy supplier to Europe and Asia will require faster permitting, more infrastructure investment, and a cleaner path for major export projects that have been delayed by regulatory fights and domestic opposition. That is where the government's message starts running into reality. Because investors do not finance speeches, they finance steel, terminals, and timelines. And right now, Canada has more ambition than spare capacity. But Canada's infrastructure is the limit. Canada's constrained pipeline network is turning into leverage ahead of upcoming US-Mexico-Canada agreement talks as Ottawa moves to capitalize on American refinery dependence on Canadian heavy crude and a tighter North American supply. MAP officials and industry sources say the pitch is straightforward. If US buyers need reliable barrels, Canada wants a better seat at the table. That leverage is not theoretical. Refineries in the U.S. Midwest and Gulf Coast are built to process heavy crude, and Canada remains one of the largest and most dependable suppliers into that system. With alternative supply routes limited and new infrastructure years away, Ottawa is arguing that Canadian barrels are not just available, they are hard to replace without raising costs. The timing matters because scarcity changes bargaining power fast. When supply tightens, refiners stop shopping for the cheapest option and start shopping for the safest one. Especially if they cannot afford interruptions in feedstock, that gives Canada room to press for better terms on market access, transportation rules, and future investment commitments as trade negotiations approach. Industry analysts say the government's message is aimed as much at Washington as at the market. The argument is that energy interdependence still cuts both ways. The U.S. needs Canadian crude. Canadian producers need U.S. refining capacity, and any attempt to weaponize trade risks hitting American consumers and industrial margins first. In other words, this is not a one-sided flex. Ottawa is also betting that refinery economics will do part of the talking for it. Heavy crude typically trades at a discount, but when supply gets tight, that discount narrows and the value of dependable deliveries rises. If Canadian exports remain steady while other sources wobble, the premium shifts from price alone to reliability. And that is where Canada's leverage starts to look a lot less academic. For U.S. refiners, the math is blunt. Replacing Canadian supply at scale would require more imports from farther away, more exposure to shipping disruptions, and more uncertainty in a market already rattled by geopolitical shocks. That is why Canadian officials are framing supply not as a favor, but as a strategic asset that Washington cannot easily sidestep. The political angle is just as important as the commercial one. Ottawa wants U.S. negotiators to see Canadian energy as part of North American resilience, not a bargaining chip to be squeezed on demand. If that message lands, Canada could enter USMCA talks with a stronger hand than it has had in years, and Trump's pressure now cuts both ways. As President Donald Trump escalates attacks on NATO and worries mount in Washington about gasoline prices ahead of the midterms, Canada is recasting energy security as a strategic asset rather than a sign of dependency. Ottawa's message is blunt. In a volatile market, reliable supply is power, and North American buyers cannot simply wish that away. The argument lands at a politically sensitive moment. Trump has tried to cast energy politics as a loyalty test, pressing allies on defense spending while also leaning on domestic fuel prices as a measure of economic strength. But Canadian officials and industry executives say that framing misses the point. If U.S. consumers, refiners, and manufacturers need stable barrels, then Canada is not a supplicant in the relationship. It is part of the system that keeps it running. That shift matters because energy dependence cuts both ways, and Washington knows it. U.S. refineries are still set up to process Canadian heavy crude efficiently. And replacing those barrels at scale would mean higher transport costs, more exposure to shipping disruptions, and a tighter squeeze on margins. In plain English, the market is not offering many clean exits, and that gives Ottawa room to argue for better treatment without sounding like it is begging for it. Canadian officials have been careful to frame the issue in national security terms, not just commercial ones. They are pointing to the resilience of domestic supply, the importance of cross-border infrastructure, and the need for policy that protects production and transport capacity over the long term. The pitch is that energy security is not about isolation. It is about having enough control over supply to avoid getting bullied when politics gets loud. That is also why the timing is so awkward for Trump. Gasoline prices remain one of the fastest ways to turn a foreign policy fight into a kitchen table backlash, and any disruption that pushes fuel higher can boomerang on a White House trying to sell economic competence. If voters start feeling pain at the pump, the blame game gets messy fast, and allies become easy targets for a president looking to redirect the heat. Canada is betting that this dynamic forces a more serious conversation in Washington. If U.S. negotiators want to posture about leverage, Ottawa wants them to remember that energy flows are not a one-way street, and that North American resilience depends on predictable cross-border trade. The message is not subtle. If you want stable supply, you do not treat the supplier like a disposable extra in the scene. Industry analysts say that is where the real bargaining map starts to change. Ottawa is no longer talking about dependency as a weakness to be managed, but as interdependence that can be priced, defended, and used in negotiations. That changes the bargaining map. The energy shock now reaching North America is forcing Washington and Ottawa into a broader negotiation over tariffs, pipelines, and Arctic security, as both governments weigh how to stabilize supply without surrendering leverage. What began as a market crisis is now moving into strategic territory, with officials on both sides of the border treating energy, trade, and defense as parts of the same bargain. In Ottawa, the message is that Canada cannot be treated as a passive supplier while U.S. politics whips around gasoline prices and alliance commitments. Canadian officials are arguing that reliable crude, cross-border infrastructure, and export capacity deserve a place in any serious bilateral deal, especially if Washington wants to reduce vulnerability to global disruptions. The pitch is simple. If North America is going to talk about resilience, then Canada's role has to be priced in, not brushed off. That pressure is landing at a moment when U.S. policymakers are already juggling domestic fuel costs, industrial supply chains, and a new round of tariff threats. Refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast remain built around Canadian heavy crude, and trade officials privately acknowledge that replacing those flows would be costly and slow. For Washington, that means any hardline move on tariffs or border policy now carries a second-order risk. It could hit the very fuel market voters notice. First, the Arctic is also moving up the agenda because energy security is no longer just about barrels and pipelines. Canadian and U.S. defense planners are increasingly focused on northern shipping routes, surveillance, and infrastructure protection as climate change opens new vulnerabilities and new strategic competition. That has pushed Ottawa to argue that energy cooperation and Arctic security should be treated as one package, not separate files handled by different desks. Industry analysts say that kind of linkage could reshape the next phase of US-Canada talks. If Washington wants more reliable access to Canadian supply, Ottawa wants guarantees on market access, infrastructure approvals, and a less erratic tariff environment. The result could be a new model of bargaining in which energy policy is tied directly to trade rules and national security planning. That would mark a clear break from the old habit of treating the bilateral relationship as a routine commercial arrangement. The new reality is that fuel, freight, defense, and border infrastructure are all part of the same strategic ledger, and neither side can ignore the math for long. As one senior analyst put it, the crisis is not just exposing dependence, it is forcing both capitals to decide what kind of North American system they actually want. A new North American order may emerge,